My daughter waited for her mother to stop breathing, to execute a purge. 6 days after the funeral, she forced me into the boardroom, shoved documents across the table, and ordered, "Sign it, then go take care of yourself." She thought I was a senile old man drowning in grief. But when the door opened, my lawyer walked in, holding a DNA test result. That's when her smile disappeared, because her mother's 40-year secret was about to be exposed. Before the story unfolds, I'd really appreciate it if you could like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Please keep in mind that certain elements are fictionalized to enhance the narrative experience. My name is Brooks Sterling, and I am 65 years old. But as I pushed open the double mahogany doors of our headquarters, I didn't feel like a titan of industry. I felt like a ghost walking through my own life. I, Brooks Sterling, the 65-year-old chairman of Sterling Maritime Logistics, adjusted my charcoal tie as I entered the boardroom, my presence commanding even through a fog of grief. Only 6 days had passed since I stood in the rain, watching the soil settle over Helena, the woman who had spent 41 years building every inch of this empire by my side. The lobby of Sterling Maritime Logistics usually hummed with the vibrant energy of global commerce, but today the air felt stagnant and heavy. My employees offered hushed whispers as I passed, their eyes darting away as if death were contagious. "They are waiting for you, Mr. Sterling," my secretary murmured, her voice thin and devoid of its usual warmth. I walked with my shoulders back, trying to ignore the bitter taste of cold coffee in my mouth and the hollowness in my chest that no amount of professional poise could fill. I expected to find a sanctuary in the boardroom, a place where my family would gather to share the quiet burden of our collective loss. Instead, as the heavy doors clicked shut behind me, I realized the room had been converted into a cold tactical arena. Victoria Sterling Redmond, the company's 40-year-old CFO, offered a smile as cold as a January morning in Seattle, her eyes already scanning the room for any sign of weakness. Beside her sat Kendrick Redmond, the 42-year-old regional logistics director, who sat stiffly beside Victoria, his knuckles white as he gripped a leather folio. There were no tears here, no shared memories of Helena. Instead, a legal notary sat at the far end of the table, flanked by a digital recorder that sat like a small black predator between us. Victoria's smile wasn't a comfort. It was a razor blade wrapped in silk, waiting for me to lean in so it could draw blood. "Sit down, Dad," she said, her voice devoid of the grief a daughter should carry. "We need to be practical." I felt a surge of righteous anger tighten my throat as I touched the cold, polished conference table. "Practical? I buried your mother on Tuesday," I replied, my voice raspy but firm. I looked at Kendrick, hoping for a shred of empathy, but he remained silent, staring at the documents as if they held the secrets to the universe. The harsh white glare of the overhead boardroom lights made the scene feel surgical, and I was the patient on the table. Victoria didn't flinch. She slid a thick stack of papers toward me, her eyes locked onto mine with a terrifying clarity. "We've had a difficult time since Mom's diagnosis, but her passing has clearly taken a toll on your judgment, Brooks. We can't allow Sterling Maritime to drift while you process your emotions. It's time for you to sign over your 51% controlling interest to me." I stared at her, the shock radiating through my limbs. "You've been planning this while she was still breathing, haven't you?" How many nights had she sat at her mother's bedside, holding her hand with one and calculating the value of her stocks with the other? The question hung in the air like smoke. Victoria leaned forward, her expression shifting from false concern to an icy ultimatum. "Sign the papers, Brooks. Learn to fend for yourself while you still have your dignity. We have a medical evaluation from a specialist, a Dr. Aris, stating that your recent lapses in memory and emotional instability make you unfit for primary decision-making. I've never met a doctor, Aris, in my life, yet here was a document claiming I was a liability in my own house." Kendrick finally looked up, but there was no help in his gaze, only the grim determination of a man following orders. I looked at the pen in Victoria's hand, then at the door, wondering if Corbin Mercer would make it in time before I lost everything my wife died to protect. The double doors didn't just open. They hit the buffer with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, echoing through the boardroom and freezing Victoria's hand an inch from the documents. The sudden violence of the movement shattered the predatory stillness Victoria had spent the last 10 minutes cultivating. Standing in the threshold was Corbin Mercer, the longtime family attorney with a face as weathered and reliable as a seawall, who strode in with a heavy briefcase and a professional nod that cut through Victoria's arrogance like a blade. He didn't wait for an invitation or offer a hollow condolence. I felt the air return to my lungs as Corbin moved toward the table with the rhythmic, heavy footsteps of a man who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. Victoria's face twisted into a mask of sharp protest, her fingers retracting from the pen as if she had been burned. "Corbin," she snapped, her voice regaining its edge, "you weren't invited to this family talk." Corbin didn't even look at her until he reached the center of the table, placing his hand firmly over the stack of papers she had been sliding toward me. "I wasn't aware we were holding a family talk in front of a notary with a digital recorder running Victoria," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded immediate silence. He turned his gaze to me, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt like more than a grieving widower. I felt like a client. He leaned over, and with a metallic snap of the briefcase latches that sounded like a cage door shutting, he began to unpack. "Victoria, I'm not here because Brooks called me." Corbin continued, casting a cold glance at Kendrick, who was now stuttering, trying to find a reason to exist in the conversation. "I am here because an automated protocol set by Helena herself before she entered hospice summoned me to this boardroom at exactly 10 o'clock this morning." Silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a predator, realizing the cage door just locked from the outside. Victoria's confidence didn't crumble, but it shifted, turning from aggression into a wary, tactical retreat. The smell of old leather and expensive fountain pen ink rose from Corbin's open briefcase as he produced a series of blue folders. These weren't the resignation papers Victoria had prepared. These were legal rebuttals bound in thick stock that felt dry and papery under my fingers as Corbin slid them toward me. "I am still the CEO, Victoria," I said, my voice finally steadying the righteous anger within me, finding a productive outlet, "and you are still my CFO. I suggest you start acting like it before your professional conduct becomes a matter for the ethics committee." Victoria rose from her chair, her high heels clicking frantically on the marble floor as she paced a small circle. "This is a mistake, Dad," she hissed, pointing a manicured finger at Corbin. "You're just delaying the inevitable. The board is already concerned." I stood tall, planting my palms on the cold surface of the conference table, and looked her directly in the eyes. "I am ending this meeting, now. This is no longer a family discussion, but a legal matter that requires my private attention with counsel. Get out, Victoria. Take your husband and your fake concern with you. You see, in the shipping business, you learn to spot a storm long before the first drop of rain hits the deck." Victoria was so busy steering the ship, she forgot to look at the horizon. She looked at Kendrick, who avoided all eye contact, looking like a man who knew the wind had just changed. They moved toward the exit, Victoria, pausing at the door to deliver one final venomous look. "We're not done, Brooks. The board meets on Monday." As the door shut behind them, Corbin turned, and the clicking sound of the heavy boardroom lock sliding into place resonated through the room. He didn't sit down. He just looked at the locked door, then back at me, his face a mask of professional grief. "Brooks," he whispered, "your wife knew this was coming. She left a map for us, and the first stop is going to break your heart." I watched Corbin's hands move across the wood, laying out folders like he was dealing a high-stakes poker hand, where the ante was my wife's memory, and the pot was our entire future. The rustle of thick, high bond paper echoed in the hollow space left by Victoria's exit, a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence. I sat heavily, my fingers absent-mindedly brushing against my heavy gold wedding band, feeling its weight like a tether to a life that was rapidly dissolving. Corbin didn't look up immediately. He seemed to be organizing a war room. He explained that while I was buried in the grief of Helena's final months, focusing entirely on her comfort and the grueling day-to-day operations of Sterling Maritime, Helena had been doing something else. She was quietly using her fading strength to scrutinize the company's internal controls. My heart hammered against my ribs when he told me she had reached out to him 6 months ago with a specific haunting concern about our daughter. "She didn't want you to carry this," Brooks Corbin said, his voice soft but firm. "Not while you were holding her hand in that hospital room." I looked at the folders, a sense of awe mingling with a sharp, stabbing pain. "So, she carried it alone?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "While she was dying, she was protecting me from our own child." Corbin nodded, pulling a document from the pile. He revealed that Helena had secretly changed her personal power of attorney to him alone, a move specifically designed to block Victoria from having any say over my medical or financial future once Helena was gone. My chest felt like it was being crushed by the weight of a 10-ton anchor. All this time, I thought I was protecting her. I was the one asleep at the wheel while she was guarding the hull. Corbin then described what he called the shadow audit. It was a forensic deep dive into the CFO department that bypassed every standard reporting line we had. He showed me the engagement letter, the ink of Helena's signature shaky, but the intent behind it as clear as a lighthouse beam. She called it Project Lighthouse. Corbin explained the sharp synthetic scent of highlighter ink wafting between us as he opened the next binder. She wanted to find the rocks before the ship hit them. The hum of the building's air conditioning system felt like a low growl in the empty room as the scale of her secret efforts began to dawn on me. "And she found them, didn't she?" I said, staring at the clinical black and white ledgers. Corbin didn't answer with words. He simply pulled a specific summary sheet. He pointed to a recurring series of payments to an entity called V&D Strategic Consulting. I stared at the name, searching my 41 years of memories for even a flicker of recognition. "Never," I said, tapping my finger on the table with growing agitation. "I know every vendor we have used since we started this in 1983. Numbers don't lie. They don't have feelings, they don't have agendas, and unlike my daughter, they don't know how to fake a smile." Corbin flipped the page, exposing more stark contrasts of bright yellow highlights over suspicious figures. He told me that Helena had flagged over a dozen of these invoices before her final breath. Then he delivered the blow that made the room spin. The audit revealed that the very first suspicious payment to this V&D shell company was processed on the exact same day Helena received her terminal diagnosis. Victoria hadn't just waited for her mother to die. She began the theft at the moment of Helena's greatest vulnerability. The betrayal was so precise, so calculated, it felt like a physical assault. Corbin slid a final page toward me, a bank statement from the shell company. I looked at the total at the bottom and felt my stomach drop into my shoes. It wasn't just a few $1,000s, it was a 7-figure betrayal. $1,247,000. That was the price tag my daughter had placed on my wife's life while she was still fighting for every breath. I stared at the bank statement Corbin had placed on my mahogany desk, the numbers blurring into jagged, irregular lines on the charts before my eyes. My hands felt physically cold, a bone-deep chill that the office heater couldn't touch, while the smell of rainy Seattle air drifted through a window I had left, cracked open. I felt the weight of every cent like a stone in my gut. I didn't just see a theft, I saw a desecration. I discovered as we dug deeper into the V&D Strategic Consulting ledger that Victoria hadn't just siphoned corporate funds. She had successfully diverted Helena's personal life insurance payout into that shell account weeks before the funeral even took place. My own child had sat at our kitchen table, mourning in her black veil, while the digital ink was still wet on a transfer of her mother's death benefit. Corbin and I spent the next hour scrutinizing the anatomy of the theft. It was a calculated harvest, with monthly wire transfers meticulously kept under the $75,000 internal audit trigger. "She didn't just take the money, Corbin," I whispered, my voice thick with a righteous indignation. "She bled the company dry while I was holding Helena's hand in hospice." Corbin adjusted his glasses, his face illuminated by the clinical blue glow of the laptop screen. "It is systematic, Brooks. Every invoice is a lie tailored to fit her CFO signature limit. A loyalty is earned in the sweat of the deck. Betrayal. That's born in the silence of an air-conditioned office. My daughter had spent her career in these rooms learning the rhythm of my trust only to weaponize it." Corbin then presented a series of photos and deeds tied to the expenditures. I saw a sprawling beach house in the San Juan Islands, its cedar siding silvered by the salt air, and a high-end luxury vehicle that sat in a dealership lot, waiting for her name. She bought a beach house while her mother couldn't even walk across the room. I said, the disgust rising in me like a tide of oil. The paper trail was undeniable. V&D was the source for every penny spent on a lifestyle she built atop her mother's casket. I stood up, the heavy grief that had anchored me for weeks, suddenly replaced by the sharp, cold focus of a predator protecting his territory. I was no longer a mourning husband. I was the chairman of the board, and my territory had been invaded by a scavenger. "Do it," I commanded. "Freeze every card, every department fund, and every access code she has." Corbin hesitated, his finger hovering over the keyboard. "Once I hit send, there's no going back. Brooks, she'll know the hunt has started." I watched him, my resolve hardening like iron in a forge. How do you tell a child you've raised that they've become a stranger? Or do you just stop calling them your child altogether? The question didn't need an answer. The answer was in the ledger. I gave the final authorization with a curt nod. I heard the sound of a single heavy mouse click echoing in the silent office, a sound as final as a gavel. Corbin's laptop screen flickered as the command executed. He revealed then that Helena's prearranged freeze wasn't just a simple lockout. She had designed it to trigger an automatic notification to the authorities and our internal security the moment Victoria tried to use a company card or log in. My wife had built a cage and handed me the key from beyond the grave. I watched the status bar on Corbin's laptop turn green, signifying Victoria's world was now officially offline. But Corbin didn't close the screen. He looked at me, his voice dropping an octave, his expression shifting into something deeply unsettled. "Brooks," he said, "there's a reason Helena didn't tell you this herself. You need to see Rosa, tonight." The wipers on my sedan fought a losing battle against the heavy Seattle mist, much like I was fighting the cold dread that Corbin had planted in my chest with a single name, Rosa. The rhythm of the blades across the glass was the only sound in the car as I navigated the winding roads toward the Ballard neighborhood. I found myself gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached, my mind racing through the implications of Corbin's urgent instruction. Why couldn't Helena tell me herself? What had been so dangerous that it required a middleman and a midnight rendezvous, I pulled up to a modest, well-kept bungalow where the air smelled of salt and aged wood. Rosa, the 58-year-old nurse who had become Helena's closest confidant in the end, opened the door with a weary, compassionate gaze that spoke of secrets held too long. "I've been expecting you, Brooks," she said, before I could even offer a greeting. "She said you'd come when the lights went out." I stepped into the warm entryway, the scent of lavender and antiseptic immediately bringing back the heavy atmosphere of Helena's final weeks. I told her Corbin had sent me, and that I was here for whatever truth my wife had been forced to hide from her own husband. Rosa didn't hesitate. She revealed that Victoria had actually visited her 2 days ago, offering a staggering sum of money to hand over any personal belongings or papers Helena might have left behind. Rosa had lied to her face, a brave act that made my throat feel dry and bitter. Victoria was already hunting, and I was only just beginning to realize the scale of the war. Ballard used to be a place for fishermen and honest work. Now it was just the backdrop for a dead woman's last stand. Rosa led me into her kitchen, where a single silver box sat on the table amid scattered medical journals. She recounted how Helena, during those long afternoons when I was out at the docks trying to keep the company afloat, would spend her limited energy recording videos on a burner laptop. Rosa described the physical toll it took on her, how Helena would cry every night, not from the cancer, but from the pain of the rot she was uncovering in our own home. My chest tightened as I listened. She was doing my job. Rosa? I admitted the guilt washing over me in a cold wave. I should have been the one watching. Rosa shook her head, explaining that Helena feared I was too good to see the darkness in Victoria until it was too late. She opened the silver box, the metallic weight of the lid feeling heavy and clinical as it clicked open. Inside sat a small, unassuming USB drive wrapped in a handwritten note. The handwriting was yellowed and shaky, the unmistakable script of a woman whose body was failing, but whose mind was sharp as a razor. Rosa explained that Helena called this her shield and sword, the only thing that could protect Arlo and me once she was gone. My wife's final instruction was explicit. I was to watch these files alone, in a place where Victoria's reach could not extend. She said you'd know the password. Brooks, Rosa whispered, her eyes searching mine. It's the one thing Victoria could never guess, because she never valued it. I took the drive, the small piece of metal, feeling like a lead weight in my palm. That's what that drive felt like. As I turned to leave, Rosa caught my arm, her expression turning even more somber. She mentioned that Helena had recorded a specific video regarding Arlo's theft from 3 years ago. The implication hung in the air like a storm cloud. Helena had found proof of a conspiracy behind my son's exile that I had never even suspected. I thanked Rosa for guarding those secrets with her life and stepped back out into the mist. The rhythmic sound of the wipers greeted me again, but the world felt different now. I gripped the drive until the metal edges bit into my skin, looking back at the dark street. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just a husband or a father. I was a man holding the detonator to my own family's destruction. I didn't turn on the lights when I got home. I didn't want the world to see what I was about to do, or the man I was about to become, once I crossed the threshold of that digital grave. The car door slammed behind me with a finality that echoed through the empty driveway, and I retreated into the house like a thief. I moved through the shadows of the foyer, and into the sanctuary of my home office, the space still smelling faintly of Helena's lavender perfume and the old paper of my maritime journals. It was 2 a.m, the hour of ghosts and regrets. I sat at my desk, the USB drive feeling like a live coal in my pocket. As I pulled it out, the blue light of the laptop screen reflected in my glasses, casting a clinical ghostly pallor over my hands. With a cold metallic click, I inserted the drive into the port. I noticed then a small jagged piece of black electrical tape covering my office webcam. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air crawled up my spine. Helena had been paranoid even here in the heart of our home. She had known Victoria might use the very technology I installed for our security to spy on her while she built this gallows. "Just you and me now, Helena," I whispered into the stillness. "Show me what I was too blind to see." The screen prompted me for a password, a blinking cursor demanding a key I didn't yet possess. I started with the obvious, my fingers dancing over the keys with a desperate hope. I tried our wedding anniversary. Access denied. I tried Helena's birthday. Access denied. I tried the date we incorporated Sterling Maritime. Access denied. Each failure felt like a personal rebuke, a reminder of the distance that had grown between us while I was busy managing a fleet and she was managing a terminal diagnosis. How many times had I sat in this very chair complaining about a delayed shipment, while my wife sat 3 feet away building a digital gallows for our own daughter? The grandfather clock in the hall ticked away the seconds, a rhythmic mocking countdown. I felt a cold sweat breaking across my forehead as I stared at the screen. "What did you value that she didn't, Helena?" I asked the empty room. I thought of our history, our shared struggles, and the people we had become. Then I remembered Rose's tired voice in that Ballard kitchen. She had said Victoria never valued what Helena did. Victoria valued power position and the clean lines of a ledger. She never valued the messy, painful loyalty of the son I had cast out 3 years ago. Arlo. My finger hovered over the number pad. I typed in Arlo's birth date the day the son I had disowned was born the boy. Victoria had so effortlessly replaced in my misguided affections. Click. The sound of a lock turning, or a trap snapping shut. I wasn't sure which one I was hearing yet. The red light on the drive turned a steady mocking green. A window titled Project Lighthouse flooded the screen, populated by 30 video files and a single folder labeled Evidence. My breath caught in my throat. Arlo. I breathed the realization crushing the air from my lungs. It was always Arlo. My God, Helena. You were planning for him all along. You knew he was the only one left with a soul worth saving. I leaned back, the leather of my chair creaking in the silence, feeling the world shift on its axis. The first file on the drive wasn't a video at all. It was a PDF titled The Bloodline Revocation, dated 4 months before Helena passed. She hadn't just been investigating, she had been rewriting the future of the Sterling name before she ever said goodbye. My finger trembled as I hovered the cursor over video number 1. The thumbnail loaded, revealing Helena sitting in her favorite wingback armchair. Her face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over her cheekbones, but her eyes were burning with a fire I hadn't seen in years. She wasn't looking at the camera, she was looking at me. And she looked terrified. Hearing her voice again wasn't like a memory, it was like a puncture wound to my soul, fresh and jagged as the audio hissed to life, and Helena's first words filled the empty office. I sat frozen in the blue glow of the monitor, my fingers still resting on the mouse, trembling so violently that the cursor jittered across her pixelated image. The physical ache in my chest blossomed into a sharp, localized pain when she looked directly into the lens and whispered, "My love." It was a term of endearment that had anchored me for 4 decades, yet coming from the speakers of a cold laptop in the dead of night. It sounded like a ghost reaching through the veil to pull me under. Helena appeared gaunt, her skin a pale, papery texture that the high-definition camera couldn't hide, but her eyes held a clarity that defied the morphine and the exhaustion. She started by acknowledging that if I was watching this, she was already gone, and I was likely drowning in the shock of a world that no longer made sense. She explained that she had spent her final months becoming a silent partner in the truth, because she knew my own nature better than I did. "My love," she said, her voice crackling through the slight static hiss of the speakers. "If you're watching this, then the vultures have already started circling. Yes, I'm sorry I had to leave you with this war, but I couldn't let them burn down what we built." I discovered through her calm, methodical narration that she had actually set up a honeypot bank account, a specific corporate fund, with just enough oversight to be visible if one looked, but enough shadow to tempt a thief. She had done it specifically to create a clear, undeniable paper trail for me to find, knowing I would never believe a verbal accusation against our own blood. They say the eyes are the windows to the soul. Looking at Helena on that screen, I saw a soul that had been forced to fight a war on two fronts: cancer in her body and a snake in her house. She began to describe Victoria not as the daughter we had raised, but as a corporate entity she no longer recognized. She detailed a chilling moment from the previous October during one of her most brutal chemotherapy sessions, when she had woken up early to find Victoria searching through her private safe in the bedroom. Helena had watched from the bed, heart pounding as Victoria bypassed the lock. She wasn't looking for a memento. Brooks Helena said, her eyes burning with a dark, weary fire. She was looking for a deed. Ambition is one thing, but Victoria, she has a hole where her loyalty should be. That day, Helena realized that the greed in our daughter's eyes was more terminal than the tumors in her own lungs. The cold mechanical hum of the laptop fan seemed to grow louder as I listened to the instructions of a ghost. Helena laid out the rules of the drive with the same precision she used to manage a shipping manifest. She commanded me to watch the videos in strict numerical order, insisting that I needed to understand the mechanics of the theft before I could grasp the weight of the why. She was insistent, her gaunt face leaning closer to the camera, as if she could sense my urge to skip ahead. Do not skip Brooks. Promise me. Video 15 will show you who she really is. Watch it last. A promise. I was making a promise to a pixelated version of a woman I'd already buried, and I intended to keep every word of it. As the recording neared its conclusion, Helena's voice dropped into a conspiratorial whisper, mentioning that Victoria didn't act alone. She had a secret partner on the board, a facilitator whose name was buried deep in the metadata of the fifth folder. The revelation felt like a second storm hitting a crippled vessel. It wasn't just a daughter's betrayal. It was a conspiracy that threatened the very foundation of Sterling Maritime. The video cut to black, but my heart was racing like a twin-engine freighter in a gale. I looked at the file list, the reflection of the static light dancing in my tear-filled eyes. Video number 2 was titled The V&D Ledger. I knew what it contained, but I wasn't prepared for the first name I'd see on the payroll. I double-clicked video number 2, and the spreadsheet that flickered to life didn't just contain numbers. It contained the names of people I had trusted for decades, now rebranded as strategic consultants for a company that didn't exist. My eyes burned from the hours spent staring at the screen, the white glare of the Excel sheets feeling like a physical assault in the pre-dawn darkness of my office. I reached for the mug on my desk, realizing I had forgotten it was empty long ago. As I scrolled through the V&D Strategic Consulting ledger, the dry click-clack of the keyboard was the only sound in the room, save for the low hum of the laptop fan. The first name on the kickback list hit me with the force of a broadside collision, my own head of security. The man I had paid for 15 years to protect the Sterling family and our assets was the very first person on Victoria's ghost payroll. It wasn't just my daughter, she had turned my own guard dog into her paid lookout. The betrayal expanded before me, from a family tragedy into a systemic corporate infection, a rot eating away at the very foundation of Sterling Maritime. Not just you, Victoria, I whispered into the silence. You bought their silence with my own money. Sterling Maritime was a grand old oak, but Victoria hadn't been climbing the branches. She'd been an infestation of termites eating the heartwood while I admired the leaves. Helena's voice returned on the video, a haunting narration to the forensic horror show on my monitor. She explained the mechanics of the risk assessment scam with a clinical precision that made my blood run cold. Victoria had been creating fake maritime risk assessment reports by simply plagiarizing old company data, some of it dating back to the 90s, and billing the firm $68,000 for each one. Helena showed the side-by-side comparisons on the screen, the grainy low-resolution texture of the PDFs highlighting the sheer laziness of the theft. She thought I wouldn't check the technical data Brooks Helena's voice murmured from the speakers. She thought her mother was too tired to read the fine print. Look at the timestamps. She was filing these while I was in the infusion chair. A physical vibration shook the room as a heavy truck rumbled past outside, rattling the window pane in its frame, a jarring reminder of the real world continuing while my reality fractured. I watched as Helena broke down the threshold masterclass Victoria had conducted. Every single invoice to V&D was calculated to be exactly $74,500. It was a calculated insult. The internal audit trigger that required my personal digital token for approval was set at $75,000. Victoria hadn't just stolen. She had studied my own internal control manual like a heist map, ensuring she stayed just below the radar. 28 months. 2 years and 4 months of quiet, polite robbery. It's almost impressive if it wasn't so damn evil. She had watched me every morning, asked me about my day, and kissed my cheek all while she was siphoning the lifeblood out of our legacy in $74,000 increments. $74,500, over and over, like a heartbeat made of theft. But as I prepared to close the file, Helena's image on the screen leaned forward, a grim smile touching her gaunt features. She revealed that she hadn't just discovered the invoices. She had quietly redirected the last 3 payments into an escrow account she controlled personally. Victoria was operating under the delusion that she had an extra $200,000 to play with a financial phantom that would vanish the moment she tried to touch it. I closed the ledger, but as the screen flickered, a notification popped up from the drive's hidden partition. It was a wire transfer for a massive amount dated just yesterday. Victoria wasn't just stealing to save, she was spending. And I was about to find out exactly what she bought with the money meant for Helena's legacy. My mouse hovered over the wire transfer details, the numbers blurring as my vision tunneled into a single monstrous figure, $320,000. The sheer scale of the transaction made the air in my office feel thin, as if the oxygen were being sucked out by the vacuum of that digital theft. I sat in the pre-dawn stillness, the only sound the rhythmic thumping of my heart against my ribs, a dull, heavy pulse that echoed the gravity of what I was seeing. I began to follow the digital breadcrumbs from the V&D Strategic Consulting account, tracing the movement of the money through a labyrinth of shell companies until it finally settled at a maritime brokerage firm based in Florida. Within seconds, I was staring at a sales contract for a 45-foot luxury cruiser, a vessel fully loaded with every premium feature imaginable. I realized then that Victoria hadn't just been siphoning money for some imagined rainy day or a desperate safety net. She was actively building a life of grotesque opulence while I was spending my nights sleeping in a plastic chair, in a hospice wing, holding Helena's hand and whispering prayers. The abstract numbers on the ledger had transformed into a clinical white glare, the hull of a boat purchased with the sweat of my cruise pension fund and the blood of my wife's legacy. I discovered as I dug into the brokerage file an attached digital photo showing the vessel being prepped for delivery. There it was, gleaming under a Florida sun, a testament to a daughter's profound betrayal. But it was the name emblazoned on the stern that truly broke something inside me. Free at last. The letters were bold and black against the white fiberglass. She wasn't mourning her mother, she was celebrating her absence. The physical image of that luxury boat made the theft feel visceral, like a blade slipping between my ribs. Shopping. She was shopping while I was choosing a casket. Let that sink in. Before I explain what that number truly means, if you're still watching this unfold, with me finish this sentence, I knew the family bond was shattered when. Comment your answer and add one reason so I can see your perspective. Please note that the next part contains dramatized details added to deepen the emotional impact. The purpose is for us to reflect on the core message. My mouse moved to the final confirmation page of the purchase, and I opened my own calendar on the side of the screen. I cross-referenced the final payment date with Helena's death certificate, and the realization was a total emotional devastation. The wire transfer for the boat had been initiated on the very morning of the funeral. While I was adjusting my charcoal tie in the mirror, preparing to lead the procession, Victoria was hitting send on a $300,000 luxury purchase. It got worse. I discovered she had used my own emergency signature override code, the one I had handed her in a moment of absolute trust, so she could handle any crisis while I was at the cemetery to authorize the final payment. The title was signed and finalized just 48 hours after we laid Helena to rest. 2 days. She couldn't even wait for the flowers on the grave to wilt. How much ice does a person need in their veins to sign a yacht title 48 hours after burying the woman who gave them everything? I sat there as the sun started to rise over the sound, the smell of old wood and a faint ocean breeze drifting through the cracked window. A hidden memo in the purchase file caught my eye, a digital sticky note from the broker. Victoria had already scheduled a victory party on the yacht for next weekend, and the guest list included several prominent board members. I stared at the timestamp on the screen until my eyes burned. The sun was starting to rise over the sound, but the world had never looked darker, because if she could do this while the dirt was still fresh on Helena's grave, I knew there was no limit to what she'd do to me. The front door didn't just rattle. It groaned under a barrage of frantic pounding that suggested the person on the other side believed they still owned every inch of the wood they were trying to break down. I stood at the top of the stairs, the cold, calculated fury from my night in the office settling into a heavy, still weight in my chest. Downstairs, the silhouette of my daughter was a jagged shadow against the frosted glass. I took my time descending the steps each footfall, deliberate, my hand sliding along the banister Helena and I had chosen together a lifetime ago. When I finally pulled the door open, the morning air rushed in, but it was immediately pushed back by the cloying, expensive scent of Victoria's perfume. She was disheveled, her eyes wide with a manic energy, while Kendrick stood behind her, his face pale and his fingers trembling as he tried to straighten a tie that was already crooked. Victoria didn't wait for a greeting. "What the hell is going on, Brooks?" she screamed, her voice cracking as it echoed through the foyer. "My corporate American Express was declined at the boutique this morning, and now the system says I'm locked out of my own department accounts." I remained unnervingly silent, letting her tirade bounce off the cold marble walls. As she gestured wildly, I noticed a sapphire pendant at her throat, a piece I recognized from a private auction catalog Helena had flagged as suspiciously high-priced 3 months ago. Victoria was wearing the evidence of her theft right in front of me, a trophy of her own treachery. "The house is still standing, Victoria," I said quietly. "Lower your voice." I turned and walked toward the kitchen, forcing them to follow me into a space that felt far too domestic for the poison they brought with them. I moved with a slow, mechanical precision, filling the kettle and placing it on the stove. The high-pitched whistle of the tea kettle began to pierce through the air, a sharp physical manifestation of the tension Victoria was radiating. I mentioned almost casually that Corbin Mercer had suggested a routine administrative audit during the leadership transition to protect the company's assets. I watched her closely as I reached for a tea mug, the ceramic cold and smooth in my hand. Tick, tock. The clock on the mantel was the only thing in the room that wasn't lying. I looked her directly in the eye, my gaze unfaltering. "Is your ledger spotless, Victoria?" I asked. "No maritime risk fees that shouldn't be there." For a split second I saw it, a flicker of pure, unadulterated fear in her pupils before she blinked it away. "My department is perfect," she hissed, her false indignation rising to a crescendo. "You're just looking for an excuse to stay in power because you're scared of being a relic. You're sabotaging your own daughter while we're still mourning." She had the audacity to invoke Helena's name, claiming my wife would be disgusted by my lack of trust. I felt a surge of ice in my veins. Victoria wasn't just my daughter in that moment. She was a storm surge hitting a reinforced seawall. She could scream all she wanted, but the wall wasn't going to move. If Helena were here, Victoria, she wouldn't be disgusted by me. I replied, my voice dropping to a level that made Kendrick flinch. "She'd be heartbroken by the choices you've made." Kendrick stared at the floor, unable to mimic his wife's boldness, his posture collapsing under the weight of his own guilt. "Get out," I said, the finality in my tone, leaving no room for negotiation. They turned to leave, Victoria still shouting threats about the upcoming board meeting. As Kendrick hurried after her, he reached for his folio and accidentally knocked a small white card from his pocket. It fluttered to the floor unnoticed by him. I watched them drive away, but it wasn't Victoria's rage that haunted me. It was the way Kendrick had looked at me right before the car door closed. It wasn't hatred in his eyes. It was a plea for help. I walked over and picked up the card. It was for a bankruptcy attorney. It seemed the $1 million theft hadn't even been enough to keep their heads above water. The silence that followed the slamming of Victoria's car door wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of heavy, pressurized quiet that precedes a structural collapse. And I was standing right at the center of the fault line. I stood in the foyer, the sharp synthetic feel of the bankruptcy card's laminate digging into the pad of my thumb. The exhaust of their sedan drifted away into the morning mist, but the weight of that little white slip of paper in my hand only grew heavier. $1 million wasn't enough to buy you peace, was it, Victoria? The irony was a bitter metallic taste in the back of my throat. My daughter, the high-flying CFO of Sterling Maritime, was financially insolvent while living in a house she'd essentially stolen from a dying woman. I looked down at the card again, realizing that the $1.2 million she'd siphoned wasn't for growth or investment. It was a desperate failed attempt to plug the holes in a sinking ship of personal debt. I walked slowly back toward the kitchen, the lingering scent of Victoria's cloying perfume clashing with the aroma of the tea I'd never actually poured. As I passed the kitchen table, something caught the morning light, a tiny, unnatural glint near the edge of the mahogany. I leaned down, my heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. Taped underside was a small hidden audio recording device. My own daughter had come into my home to bait me into a recorded admission of incompetence, hoping to catch a stray word she could use to strip me of my dignity and my company. Fear. It has a specific smell like ozone before a lightning strike, and Kendrick was drenched in it. I remembered the way he had looked at me, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold his folio. He wasn't a mastermind. He was a captive, a nerve ending that Victoria was leaning on until the bone snapped. If you ever find yourself in a room with a liar and a coward, watch the coward. The liar will look you in the eye while they stab you, but the coward will show you exactly where the knife is hidden. Kendrick was breaking, and I knew that if I could isolate him, he would be the one to show me the heart of the conspiracy. I moved through the house, seeing the traces of the life I'd shared with Helena, the way the sun hit her favorite reading chair, the slight scuff on the floorboards from her wheelchair. Victoria didn't just steal money. She had tried to steal the dignity of Helena's final days by turning them into a cover for a corporate heist. The solitude of the house felt profound, yet I wasn't alone. I was armed with the cold mission Helena had left for me. "You thought I was the one losing my mind, Victoria," I whispered as I reached the safety of my home office. "But you're the one who forgot that I built this company on the truth." The sound of the house settling was like a ship creaking in the harbor, a familiar comfort as I sat at my desk. The cold clinical blue light of my phone screen flickered, illuminating the dim office. A text message from Corbin Mercer appeared. Kendrick just made a secret 5-minute phone call to Corbin's private office line. He hadn't spoken. He'd simply listened to the dial tone and hung up, but the message was clear. He was ready to fracture. I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen, then back at the phone, the adrenaline humming in my veins. Kendrick had tried to reach out. He was ready to talk, and if I played my cards right, he'd be the one to hand me the keys to Victoria's prison cell. I sat back, the weight of the bankruptcy card still in my pocket, and prepared to dive back into the digital grave Helena had dug for our enemies. The clock struck 8, and I clicked on the file labeled Video Number 5, ready for whatever truth was waiting to be unburied. The blue light of the monitor felt like a cold compress on my tired eyes. But as I clicked on video number 5, the breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't just another ledger entry. This was the ghost of my son's reputation. I sat back in the leather chair, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the desk, the weight of the bankruptcy card still a heavy presence in my pocket. The clock struck 8, sounding like a tolling bell in the silence of the room. On the screen, Helena appeared. She was visibly weaker than in the previous recordings, wearing a thin hospital gown, with an IV line taped to the back of her hand, the background filled with the rhythmic hiss of medical monitors. "Brooks," she said, her voice a fragile rasp, "what you saw 3 years ago was a masterpiece of deception. Arlo didn't steal from us. He was the victim of a professional hit." The room seemed to tilt. I felt a metallic, sour taste of bile in my mouth as I realized the anonymous whistleblower who had originally handed me the incriminating evidence against Arlo was actually a paid actor hired by Victoria through her V&D Shell company. Helena explained that her private investigator hadn't just looked at the surface. He had dug into the digital bone of the company. The video shifted to a screen share of technical logs, the clinical white glare of the data filling my office with a harsh, unforgiving light. Helena meticulously walked me through the metadata of the emails that had served as Arlo's confession of vendor kickbacks. "Look at the timestamp, Brooks," she whispered. "Arlo was on a flight to Oregon for a warehouse inspection, while his confession was being typed from Victoria's desk. She faked his bank statements too, using the company's own imaging software to forge the deposits. How could a man with 40 years on the water be so blind to a storm brewing in his own hallway? I watched as the logs proved the admissions were sent from Victoria's internal IP address, not Arlo's. I felt a heavy rain start to pelt the office window, a frantic drumming that matched the racing of my heart. Helena's face returned to the screen, her eyes wet with tears. She explained the motive with a chilling simplicity. Arlo was the only person standing between Victoria and total CFO authority. His insistence on clean maritime ethics made him a threat to her expansion, so she removed him. She didn't just want the chair, Brooks. She wanted to erase him from your heart. My eyes filled with tears as I watched my wife break down on camera, begging for my forgiveness. She admitted she had stayed silent initially because my health was failing, and Victoria had poisoned my mind so thoroughly that she feared the truth would kill me before the cancer killed her. I had traded a son for a snake, and I had done it with a smile on my face, thinking I was protecting my legacy. The devastation was absolute. I remembered Arlo's face 3 years ago, the way he had looked at me with such confusion and hurt as I told him to leave and never come back. I had been his father, his captain, and I had abandoned him in the middle of a storm Victoria had manufactured. "Bring him home," Helena pleaded on the screen, her image flickering as she reached toward the lens. "Please bring our son home." The video ended with a final document being flashed on the screen, a memo showing that Arlo had actually been trying to report Victoria's early fraud to me the very day I disowned him. He was trying to save me, and I threw him away. The screen went black, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the monitor. I didn't just feel like a fool, I felt like a criminal. But Helena hadn't just left me with the guilt. The next file on the drive was a GPS log and a photo of a small warehouse in Portland. I sat there in the dark, the rain now a torrent against the glass, realizing that my son had been living in the shadows of my failure while I let the architect of his ruin sit at my dinner table. I stood up so fast my chair hit the back wall, the memory of Arlo's face 3 years ago, burning like a branding iron. The GPS coordinates on the screen weren't just a location in Portland. They were a stinging indictment of every mile I'd allowed to grow between me and the son I'd branded a thief. I left the office, my footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor, and walked down the hall to Arlo's bedroom. I hadn't opened this door since the day I threw him out. But as I reached for the handle, I realized Victoria had actually changed the locks shortly after he left. It was Helena who had secretly changed them back to the original key I was currently holding, a quiet defiance I had been too blind to notice. The door opened with a groan, and the smell of stale air and cedar rushed out to greet me. The room was a time capsule, a preserved piece of a life I had tried to erase. I walked inside, the sound of a lone floorboard creaking under my weight. I touched the dusty maritime engineering models on his desk, the fine lines of a hull he had been designing before I cut the rope on his future. "I didn't just lock the door, Helena," I whispered to the empty room. I tried to pretend he never existed. My mind slipped back to that traumatic day, the memory as sharp as a jagged shard of glass. A suitcase, a slammed door, a family tree pruned by a lie. I was the gardener, and I'd cut off the only healthy branch I had. I remembered standing right here, the stinging heat of tears against my cold skin, as I threw a suitcase at Arlo's feet. Victoria had stood in the shadows of the hallway, playing the role of the devastated sister, her face a mask of false sorrow, while she watched the execution she had choreographed. "Dad, please, I didn't do this." "Check the records again?" Arlo had begged, his voice cracking with a desperation that should have broken my heart. But I had refused to even look my son in the eye, blinded by the fabricated evidence Victoria had placed in my hands. "I don't have a son anymore, Arlo." I had snarled, the cold, jagged edges of the suitcase zipper biting into my palms. "Get out before I call the police." I let the memory fade, replaced by the crushing regret of the present. I knelt by the bed, my knees popping in the silence, and found a small hidden box tucked far into the corner. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Arlo had written to me during that first year of his exile, thin, crinkled textures of unmailed notes that Helena had intercepted, but kept hidden to protect them from Victoria's reach. How many nights had Arlo sat in a cheap apartment in Portland, wondering why the man who taught him to sail had let him drown in a sea of false accusations? I read the first few lines of a note dated 6 months after he left. "Dad, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I'm still trying to find a way to show you the truth. I don't hate you. I just miss home. I realized that for 3 long years, my son was reaching out, and I was busy praising the person who silenced him. Among the old papers at the bottom of the box, I found a draft of a report Arlo was writing, the very week I disowned him. It detailed Victoria's first attempts at embezzlement. He wasn't stealing from me. He was disowned for trying to protect me. I clutched the letter to my chest, the ink blurred by my own tears. I had 3 years of silence to make up for, and I didn't have another minute to waste. I stood up, my resolve hardening, but as I turned to leave, my phone buzzed with a sharp, aggressive vibration. It was a notification from the office security system. Victoria was back at the headquarters, and the alert was specific. She was currently attempting to access the primary safe in my executive suite. I didn't have time to mourn my mistakes. I had to move before Victoria realized the grave she'd dug for Arlo was about to become her own. I didn't run. I moved with the silent, predatory grace of a man who had spent 40 years navigating dark decks in high seas. Reaching my study just as the handle of the safe clicked under Victoria's touch. The clinical beep of the safe's denied biometric scan echoed like a death knell in the quiet room. Victoria jumped her hand, recoiling from the cold steel as if it had burned her. I didn't shout. I simply stood in the shadow of the doorway, watching the way the morning light caught the sheer, desperate sweat on her brow. She tried to pivot instantly, smoothing her skirt and pulling her grieving daughter persona back on like a tattered coat. I wanted to wear Mom's pearls for the board meeting. She stammered, her eyes darting toward the floor. The combinations have been changed, Victoria. I said, my voice as level as a calm sea before a gale. Everything in this room belongs to the truth now. I watched her retreat, her heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm on the hardwood. But I didn't tell her that I had purposely left a fake will in that safe, a document that leaves everything to her to ensure she feels confident enough to walk into the trap I was building. Leather. Ink. Betrayal. It's funny how the tools of a professional life can become the weapons of a personal execution. 2 hours later, I met Corbin Mercer in a secure, nondescript legal annex. The space was a stark contrast to the sterling boardroom, lit by a cold fluorescent hum that made the stacks of high bond paper look even more clinical. Corbin didn't waste time with pleasantries. He spread out 3 distinct volumes, each bound in heavy blue leather. This was the fruit of Helena's Project Lighthouse, a criminal indictment disguised as a corporate audit. We spent the morning cross-referencing every forensic detail, the smell of fresh toner and old coffee filling the small room, as we verified bank subpoenas and IP tracking logs. It's not just an audit anymore, Brooks Corbin whispered, the scratch of his fountain pen, signing off on the final engagement letters, sounding like a surgeon's incision. It's a criminal indictment. We don't just want her fired. I replied, my hands steady as I gripped the edge of the table. We want her neutralized. We spent the next hour mapping out the boardroom ambush with the precision of a naval blockade. We decided to let Victoria take the lead, allowing her to present her case for my unfitness and emotional instability. Now we would let her fire the first shot, let her think she had finally unseated the Titan only to have the ground collapse beneath her. I realized that for the trap to work, I had to maintain my broken persona for 72 more hours. It's a lonely way to live, but it's the only way to survive a snake. 3 days, I told Corbin. I can be a ghost for 3 more days. As we prepared to leave, Corbin identified the final piece of the rot, James Whitfield. The board member I had considered a brother for 30 years had been the one feeding Victoria information about my private movements. The betrayal felt like a secondary infection, but there was no time to mourn it. Corbin closed the final binder with a snap that sounded like a coffin lid hitting the vault. The stage is set, Brooks. But before we face the board, there's one more file you need to see. It's not a video. It's a lab report Helena hid in a different state. I looked at the folder he was holding, the weight of the coming revelation already pressing against my chest. The drive to Portland felt different this time. It wasn't just a search, it was a pilgrimage to the truth Helena had died to protect. The pixelated PDF didn't just load. It detonated on my screen, revealing a cold scientific truth that rendered 40 years of my family history a carefully constructed fiction. I sat in the oppressive silence of my home office at 1 a.m, the blue-white strobe of the lab report's graphs reflecting off my glasses, like the cold light of a distant star. It was a comparative DNA analysis, a document Helena had hidden behind layers of high-security encryption on a server I never knew existed. I read the numbers once, then again, my mind refusing to process the clinical finality of the data. Paternity probability 0.00%. 0%. 40 years of fatherhood, of midnight fevers and high school graduations, and it all comes down to a 0. I discovered through Helena's accompanying notes that I had actually signed adoption papers for Victoria when she was just 2 years old, but Helena had buried the original birth certificate in a separate vault to ensure I never felt she wasn't mine. I had lived a lie of my own, making fueled by a woman who loved me enough to protect me from the truth, even as that truth began to rot our foundation. Who are you, Victoria, and whose blood are you actually carrying? DNA. Deoxyribonucleic acid. 3 letters that just erased 40 years of bedtime stories and graduations. I felt a hollow ache in my chest that had nothing to do with the grief of losing Helena and everything to do with the realization that the stranger currently robbing my company was exactly that. Stranger, I clicked on video number 10, the next file in the sequence. Helena appeared on the screen looking ghostly and frail, but her eyes held a sharp, calculating glint that I had seen 1,000 times across a boardroom table. She didn't waste time with apologies. She explained that Victoria was the child of a relationship she'd had before we met, a secret she kept to protect our daughter from the social stigmas of 40 years ago. But Helena had seen the predator Victoria was becoming. She told the camera, and by extension me, that she had amended her will to include a bloodline clause. This legal maneuver restricted the controlling interest of Sterling Maritime to my direct biological descendants only. "Victoria is mine," she whispered from the digital grave, "but she isn't yours, Brooks, and she has forfeited her right to your sweat. I did this because the company only survives if it stays in the hands of the man who truly shares your heart, Arlo." I closed the laptop, the click of the lid echoing like a gunshot. I grabbed my keys and the scrap of paper, with Arlo's last known address in Portland. I-5 was a gray ribbon of penance stretching toward the Oregon border, and I was a man trying to outrun his own shame at 70 miles per hour. The rhythmic, hypnotic slapping of the windshield wipers against the drizzling rain matched the thumping of my heart. The smell of damp asphalt and diesel fuel filled the cabin as I pushed the sedan south through the pre-dawn gloom. The vibration of the steering wheel against my white-knuckle grip was the only thing keeping me grounded. "Wait for me, Arlo," I whispered to the empty car. "I'm coming to bring the whole world back to you." I was a man possessed by a singular restorative purpose. As the pale watery gray of a northwest sunrise began to bleed over the Columbia River, my phone buzzed in the center console. It was a digital alert from my security team in Seattle. Victoria's lawyers had just attempted to file an emergency incapacity injunction against me, claiming I was mentally unfit to lead. She was trying to lock the doors of a house I had already left. I saw the Welcome to Oregon sign flash by in the headlights, a neon gateway to a second chance I didn't deserve, but was determined to take. My phone buzzed again with a call from Victoria's lead attorney. I didn't answer. I just pushed the pedal down, knowing that by sunrise the only son I had left would have to decide if I was worth saving. I pulled the sedan to the curb in front of Sterling Logistics Solutions, the engine ticking in the damp Oregon morning as I saw a shadow move behind the glass, a man with my jawline and his mother's focused eyes. The industrial district of Portland looked like a graveyard of rusted iron and broken dreams in the morning light. But here, in this small pocket of productivity, my son had built a fortress. I sat in the driver's seat paralyzed for a long moment, watching Arlo through the window. He looked rugged-bearded and significantly more mature than the broken young man I had exiled 3 years ago. While I was busy believing curated lies in a high-rise office he had been busy surviving, I noticed several men moving crates across the floor, their faces strikingly familiar. I realized with a jolt of shame that they were former Sterling Maritime employees, the very ones Victoria had fired during her first wave of restructuring. Arlo hadn't just built a company. He had built a shadow fleet for the discarded. He didn't drown. He just built his own harbor. I stepped out of the car, the cold, damp air of the Oregon morning clinging to my suit like a reminder of the years I'd wasted. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached the glass door. Their eyes met mine. The recognition on Arlo's face wasn't joy. It was a flash of pure, unadulterated pain that quickly hardened into a mask of icy indifference. He didn't reach for the handle. Instead, he turned his back on me and started walking toward the rear of the warehouse. I pushed inside, the smell of diesel industrial grease and wet concrete filling my senses. "Arlo, stop. Just give me 3 minutes," I shouted, my voice sounding desperate against the cavernous metal rafters. "You had 3 years, Brooks," he called back, his voice flat, not even slowing his pace as he wove through the stacks of shipping crates. "You're out of time. Indifference. That's the real killer." I could have handled his anger. I could have absorbed his shouting. I wasn't prepared for the crushing weight of his silence. I followed him, my 65-year-old lungs burning, as I navigated the yellow forklift safety lines on the warehouse floor. I was a tugboat trying to push a battleship that had already decided its course, and I was running out of fuel. I stumbled slightly, my heavy breathing echoing in the vast space, while a distant metal grinder elsewhere in the industrial park shrieked like a dying bird. "I have the proof, Arlo," I cried out, reaching for the edge of a steel rack to steady myself. I saw the videos. Helena, she found everything. She knew what Victoria did. Arlo stopped abruptly, but he didn't turn. He was standing at the threshold of a small, windowless back office. "Don't you dare use her name to get a hearing now," he whispered, and the quietness of his tone was more terrifying than a roar. I reached the doorway, my hands trembling. Arlo stood with his back to me, his shoulders rigid and his hands clenched into white-knuckle fists. The air in the warehouse felt frozen, a pressurized chamber of 3 years of unspoken grief. I stood there, a man of 65, who had once commanded a global fleet, feeling small and utterly insignificant. I had the binders. I had the lab reports. But looking at the rigid line of my son's back, I realized that facts might not be enough to mend a soul. Arlo finally turned around, and the look in his eyes wasn't just anger. It was the same chilling, strategic coldness I'd seen in Helena's videos. He looked at me with a terrifying lack of empathy. "I saw your car, Brooks. I saw it 3 times in the last month parked down the block. I assume Victoria sent you to finish the job." He stepped closer, his presence looming over me in the cramped office. He didn't want my apology. He wanted me to hurt. The back office felt like a pressurized chamber, the air so thick with 3 years of unspoken grief I could barely swallow. I didn't try to defend myself with words. I simply reached into my charcoal jacket and pulled out the cream-colored envelope, the one with Arlo's name written in Helena's perfect rhythmic cursive. As I held it out, the scent of old paper and Helena's lingering rose-scented perfume drifted from the stationery, a ghost of her presence filling the small, cluttered room. Arlo's gaze dropped to the envelope, and I saw his fingers begin to tremble, a frantic vibration that matched the pulse I could see thrumming in his neck. "She wrote this 2 weeks before the end," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's for you, Arlo. Only you. I'll be outside. Take your time." I stepped out of the office to give him the privacy he had earned through 3 years of exile, leaning my back against a stack of wooden pallets in the main warehouse. The Portland rain had begun to drum a heavy, irregular rhythm on the corrugated metal roof, a sound that felt like a countdown. Arlo revealed something then that made my heart stutter. He told me Helena had actually wired him $50,000 a month before she passed to help him expand this very business. She had been investing in his exile while I was busy nursing my own wounded pride. Paper. Such a flimsy thing to hold a family together. And yet Helena's stationery felt more durable than the steel beams surrounding us. Through the office glass, I watched my son's physical reactions as he read the words I would never be privy to. I saw his shoulders heave, his head dropping into his hands as the weight of his mother's plea hit him. I knew what she would have said, that I was terrible at showing it, but that I never stopped looking at his old photo on my desk. Every morning for 1,000 days I had looked at that picture and felt the shame I was too proud to name. 10 minutes later, Arlo emerged from the office. His face was a raw, tear-stained mess in the gray morning light, and his eyes carried a different kind of weight, a softness that replaced the strategic coldness from moments ago. She said, "You never stopped looking," he croaked, leaning against the doorframe for support. "I never did, Arlo," I replied, stepping toward him. "Not for a single day. How do you explain to a man that you love him when you spent 3 years acting like his name was a curse? We didn't embrace yet. The chasm was too wide for a single bridge." Instead, Arlo led me out to the warehouse parking lot, away from the prying eyes of the employees he had saved from Victoria's greed. We sat on the cold, wet metal of his work truck's tailgate, the damp morning air clinging to our clothes. The distant sound of a foghorn on the Willamette River groaned in the distance, a lonely sound that fit the mood perfectly. Arlo admitted he had almost given up on ever seeing me again, but Helena's words had forced a crack in the armor he'd spent years welding shut. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Brooks," he said, looking out at the industrial park. "But I can't let her down. That's more than I deserve," I said, feeling a flicker of solemn hope. "Just listen to what she planned. Please." Arlo reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of folded papers. He showed me a series of threatening letters he had received from Victoria's personal lawyers over the last year. She wasn't just content with his exile, she had been actively trying to bankrupt his startup from 300 miles away. The betrayal was total, a multi-front war she had waged, while we were both looking the other way. Arlo folded the letter and looked at me, his jaw set in that sterling line I knew so well. "All right," he said, his voice dropping into a low tactical hum. "Tell me about this bloodline clause. Tell me how we take her down." I cleared a stack of shipping manifests off Arlo's desk, replacing them with the blue-bound folder that held the explosive truth about the woman he still called his sister. We moved from the emotional debris of the parking lot to the tactical safety of his back office, a cramped space that smelled of industrial toner and rainy concrete. Arlo sat heavily in his creaking desk chair, his rough working man hands a stark contrast to the smooth, clinical surface of the legal folder I had just placed before him. The muffled sound of a forklift operating outside the office provided a rhythmic industrial heartbeat to the tension in the room. I began by laying out the timeline of Victoria's theft, watching his jaw set, as I explained that her greed wasn't just a byproduct of Helena's illness. It was a calculated seize for power that had started years ago. She didn't just frame you to get you out of the house. Arlo, I said, my voice low and steady. She did it to clear the path to the vault. I knew she was ambitious, Dad. He replied, his eyes fixed on the ledger entries, but I never thought she'd cannibalize our own name. Arlo revealed then that he had actually been contacted by Victoria's husband, Kendrick, 2 months ago. He had ignored the calls, assuming they were part of another harassment scheme. How do you tell a man that the sister he grew up with is a genetic stranger who's been trying to bury him for 3 years? The question echoed in my mind as I prepared to deliver the hardest truth. I reached across the desk, turning the page to the DNA laboratory report Helena had hidden so carefully. Victoria isn't mine, Arlo. I watched the cognitive dissonance play out across his face. Helena had her before we ever met. I adopted her when she was 2, and we both agreed to keep it buried to protect her from the stigma of the time. Arlo was visibly stunned, his entire childhood memory bank being re-indexed in real time. So, all those times, she told me I didn't fit the family mold, he whispered, looking up at me with wide, searching eyes. She was the one who didn't fit blood. It's supposed to be thicker than water. But in Sterling Maritime, it was just the ink used to sign a death warrant. I explained that Helena had only revealed this in her final months to ensure the bloodline clause she'd inserted into the Harrison Legacy Trust was ironclad. Because Victoria has no biological link to me, she is legally ineligible to inherit the controlling 51% shares. The shares only transfer to a direct biological descendant of mine, I said, leaning forward into the cold clinical blue light of his laptop screen. That's you, Arlo. Only you. I showed him a hidden note from Helena's diary I'd found in the metadata of the drive. It implied that Arlo's biological status was the very reason Victoria had targeted him so viciously. She may have suspected the truth about her own origin long ago and saw him as the only legitimate threat to her ascension. Arlo realized then that he was no longer an exiled son, but the sole legal heir to the empire we had built. She thinks she's walking into a coronation, doesn't she? He asked, a grim, strategically lethal clarity entering his gaze. I nodded. She has no idea the ground is already gone. Arlo leaned back, the office chair creaking in the silence as a ticking wall clock echoed the growing pressure. He looked at the folder, then at me. If she finds out we're talking before that meeting, he whispered, his voice dropping into a low, tactical hum, she won't just sue us. She'll burn every bridge on the way down. We didn't take the main highway back into Seattle. Arlo led me through back roads and logging routes, keeping my sedan hidden in the spray of log trucks, until we could slip into the city like ghosts returning to haunt their own house. I discovered during a brief rest stop that Victoria had been using a GPS tracker on my car, but Arlo found it with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 3 years looking over his shoulder. He transferred the small magnetic device to a long-haul truck heading to Canada, ensuring Victoria would be staring at a map of the border while we were moving into position behind her. I smuggled Arlo into the Sterling family home, through the old service entrance, the heavy iron door creaking as if in protest of our stealth. We avoided the main floor, entirely retreating to the shadows of my study, where the rhythmic blinking of the red light on the security monitor provided the only illumination. Stay away from the windows, Arlo, I whispered, watching him pace the perimeter of the room. Victoria still has the gate codes. He stopped, looking at the familiar mahogany bookshelves and the maritime charts we had pored over when he was a boy. I never thought I'd be a fugitive in the house I grew up in, he replied, his voice carrying a bittersweet edge that cut through my professional resolve. Over the next 4 days, my study became a war room. We worked side by side, sharing late-night meals in the kitchen and whispering about the past we had lost and the future we were trying to reclaim. 30 calls. 30 attempts to explain away the unexplainable. I didn't even listen to the voicemails. Why bother hearing a snake hiss when you already know its venom is lethal? I watched Arlo go through Helena's evidence binders, his sharp maritime mind refining the presentation for the board, with a brilliance that reminded me of his mother. Mom didn't just find the fraud, Dad, he said, tapping a forensic spreadsheet. She structured the evidence so Victoria would have no exit strategy. I looked at him, seeing the man he had become in the crucible of Portland. She always was the better navigator, I admitted, feeling a surge of pride that nearly eclipsed the shame of my own failures. On the night before the board meeting, we stood on the waterfront balcony, the cold, damp iron of the railing biting into my palms. The city lights below us looked like a circuit board, and tomorrow we were going to pull the master fuse on Victoria's ambition. We finalized the strategy with Corbin Mercer over an encrypted line, ensuring the bloodline clause would be the final killing blow. The cold night air filled my lungs, a clean, sharp scent that felt like an omen of the coming storm. "Are you ready for tomorrow, son?" I asked, the sound of a distant foghorn echoing off the hills. "It's going to be brutal." Arlo didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the dark waters of the Sound. "I'm not doing this for revenge anymore, Dad. I'm doing it for Mom." I reached into my closet and pulled out my heavy tailored suit jacket, readying it for the morning. Just as I was about to turn in, I received a notification on my phone. Victoria had just attempted to drain the company's petty cash reserves, a frantic grab for whatever liquid assets remained. It was the move of a cornered predator who knew her time was running out. Arlo turned away from the railing then and looked at me, his face illuminated by the pale clinical moonlight. "There's one thing Mom didn't put in the binders, Dad, something I found in the letters she sent me in Portland. Victoria isn't just stealing money, she's hiding a body." I froze, the weight of the suit jacket suddenly feeling like lead in my hands. The silence of the night became absolute, save for the thumping of my heart. The game hadn't just changed, it had turned into something I was no longer sure I could survive. I walked into that glass-walled conference room, looking like a man who had finally run out of wind, a hollowed-out shell of the titan I used to be, just to see the hungry light of victory dance in Victoria's eyes. I intentionally moved with a slight stoop, letting my heavy footsteps echo against the polished marble, as if each stride were a burden I could no longer carry. Brooks Sterling was playing the ghost for the benefit of a predator. The Skyline conference room on the 50th floor of Mercer Tower was clinical and cold, smelling of expensive leather and the faint ozone scent of a laser printer that had recently finished churning out my death warrant. Victoria and Kendrick were already seated. My daughter wore a sharp power suit that screamed CEO, her posture leaning in toward the head of the table, like a wolf scenting blood. Kendrick, by contrast, was leaning back, his eyes fixed on the city hum, filtering through the triple-pane glass, refusing to witness the cruelty about to unfold. "You look tired, Dad," Victoria said, her voice dripping with a patronizing sympathy that made my skin crawl. "Let's make this quick so you can finally rest." I sank into a chair, the cold, smooth sensation of the glass conference table chilling my palms. "I've had enough rest, Victoria. I'm here to listen." I took a sip of stale corporate mineral water from a plastic cup, letting it sit bitter in my mouth. 50 stories up, high enough to see the whole harbor, but not high enough to escape the truth. Victoria didn't waste a second. She slid a settlement agreement across the table, her perfectly manicured nails tapping a rhythmic, impatient beat on the legal pad. She framed her 2-year embezzlement not as a crime, but as an early distribution of her inheritance. She spoke to me as if I were a confused child, suggesting that if I signed over my voting shares by noon, she would drop the medical claims of my mental incapacity. "It's a generous offer, Brooks," she said, her smile never reaching her eyes. "We call it a family loan, and the audit goes away." Generosity. I asked, my voice thin and reedy, maintaining the mask. "Is that what we're calling it?" Now I noticed then that she had already moved Helena's personal mahogany desk from the private office into this room, a symbolic act of grave robbing that solidified the ice in my veins. My daughter's arrogance was becoming a physical weight in the room. She began to criticize Helena's lack of vision in her final months, claiming my wife had let emotions cloud the business. "Mom was weak at the end, Brooks. I won't be." She then revealed her masterstroke. She had already pre-signed a contract with our primary rival to sell off 30% of the Sterling fleet. She assumed her coronation was a done deal. How do you tell someone that the chair they're sitting in is actually a trapdoor? You just wait for them to get comfortable. Victoria leaned forward, the hungry light in her eyes now a full blaze. "Sign the shares, Brooks. Or I take the evidence of your instability to the press at 12:01. "You really think you've thought of everything, don't you?" I asked. I looked at the pre-signed contract, then at the clock on the wall. It was 10:14 a.m. I felt the stoop in my shoulders vanish as I sat up straight, the reedy voice replaced by the booming authority that had launched 100 ships. "You're right about one thing, Victoria," I said, my gaze locking onto hers until she visibly flinched. "Leadership is about vision, and yours is remarkably narrow. You didn't even see who followed me into the building this morning." I looked past her toward the heavy oak door. She followed my gaze, her confusion turning into a sharp, jagged edge of panic as the handle began to turn. The door didn't just open. It swung wide with a rhythmic certainty that silenced Victoria's demands, revealing a man who looked exactly like the son I had disowned, but with the eyes of a soldier who had just returned from a long, bitter winter. Arlo Sterling strode into the high-rise conference room, bypassing the shocked secretary who tried to stammer a protest. I stood tall at the head of the table, the stoop in my shoulders vanishing like mist in the sun, and I introduced my son not as a guest, but as the primary witness to the findings of our internal audit. Victoria's face drained of color, her skin turning a sickly translucent white under the harsh fluorescent lights. "You're supposed to be in Portland hiding in your own failure," she hissed, her voice cracking. Arlo didn't stop until he was standing directly across from her husband. The heavy rhythmic sound of his work boots on the expensive carpet seemed to shake the room's clinical foundations. "I was never failing," Victoria, Arlo replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I was just waiting for the truth to catch up to you." He revealed then that he had been recording every harassment call she'd made to him over the last 3 years, and the audio was currently being live-streamed to the company's internal compliance server. The air in the room didn't just feel thin, it felt electric, like the seconds before a lightning strike hits the mast. Corbin Mercer stood and activated the boardroom's projection system with a sharp click. The first image to fill the wall wasn't a performance report, but the stylized logo of V&D Strategic Consulting LLC. I watched the blue light of the projector flicker against Victoria's pale skin as I explained to the gathered board members that this entity had been the primary drain on company capital for 28 months. This is a legitimate business venture. "I disclosed this," Victoria shouted, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the edge of the table. "You disclosed nothing." I countered, my hands steady against the cold glass table. "You billed Sterling Maritime for risk assessments that Corbin has proven were copied word for word from our own 2012 archives." Corbin then presented the Delaware registration papers, naming Victoria and Kendrick as the sole owners. Victoria's power suit suddenly looked like a costume. She wasn't the captain anymore. She was a stowaway caught with her hands in the rations. I signaled Corbin to shift the presentation to the money trail. The image on the wall changed to a wire transfer for $320,000 to a maritime brokerage in Florida. I highlighted the date of the yacht title, 48 hours after Helena's funeral. An audible gasp rippled through the room from board members who had worshipped my wife. "While I was at the cemetery," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a roar, "you were choosing leather upholstery for a cruiser called Free at Last. How dare you? How dare you use my mother's death against me?" Victoria shrieked, but her moral outrage was a hollow shell. I projected a final document, a loan application, where Victoria had attempted to put Sterling Maritime's headquarters up as collateral for a private loan to cover her mounting debts. The sight of the board members' white-knuckle grips on their folders told me everything I needed to know. The sharp metallic smell of the conference room's recycled air felt like a tomb. Her world was collapsing, and she was the one who had pulled the lever. I looked at the board members, then back at Victoria. Her mouth was open, but no words were coming out. "That's just the money, Victoria," I whispered into the deafening silence. "We haven't even talked about your husband yet." I turned my gaze to Kendrick, who looked like he was trying to vanish into the expensive leather of his chair, his skin the color of a fish belly, and his eyes darting toward the door, as if he expected the FBI to kick it down at any second. The tension in the room was palpable, a sickening cocktail of failure and hubris. Arlo stepped forward, his presence looming over Kendrick, and I saw the last of my son-in-law's resolve simply evaporate. "Kendrick," I said, my voice as steady as the rhythmic tapping of my pen against the mahogany table, "you are listed as the co-owner of V&D Strategic. You signed every wire transfer." Kendrick's voice didn't just break, it shattered into a wet, pathetic sob that filled the clinical silence of the boardroom. "I told you, Vicky. I told you your father would find out." He wailed, burying his face in his trembling hands. "I didn't want the yacht, Brooks. I just wanted her to stop screaming about our debt." Then came the blow that finally stripped the skin from the game. Kendrick revealed that Victoria had been planning to divorce him and flee to the San Juan beach house alone once the fleet sale was finalized. He had found the papers in her private cloud account. She had no loyalty to him, even as he helped her bleed us dry. "I've already signed it," Brooks Kendrick blurted out, his eyes red and leaking. "I signed a preliminary confession with the district attorney's office this morning. I'm cooperating. Cracks. Not in the glass walls, but in the marriage. And it was much louder than I expected." Victoria turned on him with a savagery that made the veteran board members flinch. Her face twisted into a mask of pure concentrated malice, her teeth bared like a cornered animal. "You're a weak, pathetic excuse for a man, Kendrick," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the triple-pane glass. "You're nothing. I built this fleet while my father was chasing ghosts." She stood up, her perfectly manicured nails raking across the table, as if she wanted to tear the truth out of the air. She tried to argue that the board owed her, that she was the only one with the stomach to lead Sterling Maritime into the next decade. I watched as the last of her professional mask dissolved into a grotesque display of entitlement. Have you ever watched a fire consume itself because it ran out of things to burn? That was Victoria. She'd burned through her mother, her brother, and now her husband. I looked at the board members, their faces grim and unmoving, all in favor of immediate termination for gross misconduct and a referral for criminal prosecution. I asked. The room went into a sudden, absolute silence. One by one, 5 hands rose into the air. Motion carries. 5-0. "Victoria," I said, looking her dead in the eye, "you are officially an outsider. You have 10 minutes to clear your desk under the supervision of the new security detail." I revealed then that the head of security she had bribed had been fired an hour ago and had already provided a sworn statement regarding her attempts to hide the yacht title. How do you tell someone that the chair they're sitting in is actually a trap door? You don't. You just wait for them to get comfortable before you pull the lever. The vote was recorded, the gavel of my own hand hitting the table with a final echoing thud. But as Victoria stood up to scream one last time, the door at the far end of the room opened again. It wasn't the police. It was Sarah, my executive assistant, and she was holding a genetic report I hadn't even shown the board yet. The room stayed silent as Corbin took a single thin sheet of paper from the back of the folder, the one Helena had called the bloodline sentence. The room stayed silent as Corbin took a single thin sheet of paper from the back of the folder, the one Helena had called the bloodline sentence. Sarah, the 45-year-old acting CFO, who had been Helena's protege, entered with a clinical precision that mirrored her late mentor. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked straight to Corbin and handed him the final piece of the puzzle Helena had spent 40 years hiding. This was the document that would turn Victoria's birthright into a legal fiction. Corbin took the paper and projected the DNA summary onto the wall, the blue light of the charts reflecting off the triple-pane glass and casting a ghostly hue over Victoria's pale skin. The scientific conclusion was absolute, a 0.00% probability of paternity between myself and Victoria. The boardroom already reeling from the fraud, evidence fell into a stunned, tomb-like silence as the directors realized the woman who claimed the throne had no biological link to the man who built it. Corbin cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the smell of ozone and burnt coffee. "This is Article 4, Section B of the Harrison Legacy Trust," he announced. "The Bloodline Clause. Only biological heirs of Brooke Sterling can hold controlling shares." Victoria stood in mid-scream, her face a contorted mask of denial. "That's a lie," she shrieked. "You faked it. I'm a Sterling." Corbin didn't even flinch. He revealed that Helena had actually shared these DNA results with the company's insurance underwriters months ago, meaning Victoria's CFO bond was already void before she even stepped into this room. 0. It's a small number, round, empty. Just like the space where Victoria's loyalty should have been. I sat with the cold, heavy weight of the mahogany table under my palms, watching her total psychological collapse. Her rage turned into a pathetic, high-pitched whimpering as she looked to Kendrick, who only turned away in shame. She looked to the board members she thought she'd bought, finding only masks of absolute disgust. Finally, her eyes landed on Arlo. Next to her, 0. The projector displayed Arlo's match, 99.99%. The reality that she was legally and biologically an outsider in the only world she ever valued caused her to physically sink into her chair. Her power suit, once a symbol of her calculated ambition, suddenly looked several sizes too big for her frame. "You were never a Sterling, Victoria," I said, my voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "You were just a guest who stayed too long and stole too much. I did everything for this company," she sobbed, her hands clawing at the glass table. "You can't just erase me. Have you ever seen a world vanish in the time it takes to read a single sentence Victoria had? And I was the one who turned the page." I gave a final solemn nod to the security team waiting by the door. Victoria was hoisted from her chair, her heels scuffing desperately and uselessly against the plush carpet as she was led out of the high-rise suite. I stood at the window, watching the distant muffled sound of a siren rising from the Seattle streets 50 stories below, while the board formally recognized Arlo as the successor in waiting. "See them to the elevator," I instructed the guards. "Ensure their personal devices are wiped and retained for the prosecutor." As Victoria was dragged out, she twisted her head back one last time, screaming that Arlo wasn't perfect either, hinting at some dark secret in his Portland business that we hadn't uncovered. I ignored her, turning to my son. "Ready to go to work, Arlo." He nodded, but before he could speak, the victory in the boardroom tasted like ash. My phone buzzed with an urgent alert from Juniper's nanny. Victoria hadn't just lost the company. She had initiated her final, most desperate contingency involving my granddaughter. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me. The monster I had just cast out still had one weapon left. The victory in the boardroom tasted like ash the second I saw the panic in the nanny's text message. I watched the sirens fade into the gray mist of the Puget Sound, but the triumph felt like seawater and iron the moment I read the 3 words on my phone. "She's not here." The high-pitched electronic chime of a priority notification had sliced through the heavy silence of the conference room, and my blood turned to ice. The message from Juniper's nanny was frantic. Victoria had sent a private courier to pick up my granddaughter from school 2 hours early. I realized with a sickening jolt that Victoria knew the board meeting was a trap. She hadn't been planning to fight to the end. She had been planning an exit with a human bargaining chip. I discovered as Corbin frantically coordinated with the authorities that Victoria had already pre-booked 2 one-way tickets to Zurich for herself and Juniper. Kendrick's name was nowhere on the manifest. She had been ready to discard her husband just as easily as she had discarded me. She tried to take her Corbin. I whispered, my voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. She tried to take Juniper. I stood at the window, watching the cold, persistent drizzle of Seattle rain on the glass, while Corbin barked orders at his security detail. "We'll find her, Brooks," he assured me, his face a mask of cold resolve. "The police are already intercepting the car." Relief. It's a dangerous emotion. It makes you soft when you still need to be a spear. I couldn't afford to be soft. Not yet. 20 minutes later, the chime sounded again. A call confirmed that the courier, a hired driver, who likely had no idea he was participating in a kidnapping, was stopped 2 blocks from the school gates. Juniper was safe. Sarah was already on her way to collect her and bring her to the headquarters for protection. I felt a surge of relief that nearly buckled my knees, a physical release that left me lightheaded. "Good," I told Corbin, my voice regaining its iron. "Bring her through the lobby. I want her to see what her mother chose." We descended to the ground floor, the elevator ride feeling like a drop into a secondary war zone. As the doors opened, the smell of ozone and wet wool in the crowded lobby hit me. The board members trailed behind me and Arlo like a funeral procession. The police were bringing Victoria and Kendrick back through the main entrance for a final processing of evidence at their desks. I saw Sarah standing near the fountain, holding Juniper's hand. The child looked small and confused, her rabbit-stuffed toy clutched tightly against her chest. As the officers led Victoria forward, the sight of the police handcuffs' clinical polished steel seemed to catch the light, drawing every eye in the room. "Mommy, why are you wearing those?" Juniper's small, high-pitched voice echoed off the marble. The sound of her stuffed toy hitting the floor with a soft thud was the only other noise in the cavernous room. Victoria's last shred of defiance vanished, her shoulders sagging, as she looked at the daughter she had been willing to steal and sell. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that her mother traded her safety for a yacht and a beach house? I didn't have the words. I only had the truth. "Look at her, Victoria," I said, my voice carrying to the furthest corners of the lobby. "This is the legacy you were so eager to inherit." As the officers turned to lead her away, Victoria snapped. She screamed at the girl, her face contorting into something unrecognizable. "Grandpa is the one who took me away, Juniper. He's the one who's hurting us." It was one last act of psychological warfare, a poison dart aimed at a child's heart. The police car doors slammed outside, and as the sirens started up again, Arlo put his hand on Juniper's shoulder, pulling her close. But my attention was pulled toward a news van, skidding into the plaza, the tires screeching on the wet pavement. Victoria's plan hadn't stopped with the arrest. The first leak was already hitting the airwaves. The camera flashes weren't just lights. They were the first volleys of a secondary war Victoria had launched from the back of a precinct transport, designed to blind the public to her theft and cast me as the monster. I ushered Juniper and Arlo back into the lobby, shielded by the heavy glass of the Sterling Maritime entrance. But the damage was already rippling through the digital ether. The sharp, repetitive popping of camera flashes through the windows felt like physical blows. I retreated to a secure side office with Corbin and Arlo, my chest tight with a protective instinct that had no outlet. A major Seattle news outlet had just posted an exclusive audio file, and as Corbin hit play, my blood turned to ice. It was a heavily edited version of the recording Victoria made during her dawn visit to my home. In the edit, my strategic testing of her guilt sounded like erratic, delusional threats. Victoria's panic was framed as the plea of a daughter terrified of my declining mental state. She cut out the entire part where I asked about the ledger. Brooks Corbin said, his face pale in the glow of the monitor. It just sounds like you're screaming at her for no reason. She didn't just leak it to the press. She sent it to the Precinct 4 tip line. I discovered then that Kendrick had already changed his story at the precinct, claiming I had coerced his earlier confession through physical intimidation. Before my legal team could even begin to draft a rebuttal, the heavy office doors opened. Detective Miller, a stone-faced veteran with 30 years of seeing families tear each other apart, looked at me with a weariness that suggested he'd already decided I was guilty. Beside him was Detective Vance Younger, and noticeably more aggressive, who kept his hand near his belt as if I were a threat rather than a victim of corporate theft. Mr. Sterling, we have a duty to investigate the audio file. Miller said, his voice flat and unyielding. It contains what sounds like a threat against your daughter's life. It's a fabrication, I replied, my voice holding a cold, hard edge of anger. I have the unedited drive in my safe. They asked Arlo to step out, isolating me in my own executive suite. Click, play. The sound of a lie being spun at 440 hertz. My own voice, but not my words. I realized Victoria's goal wasn't to win the company back today. It was to ensure I was legally detained long enough for her lawyers to freeze our fraud binders as tainted evidence. Before I reveal what happened next in that room, let me ask you, if you were in my shoes, would you trust the system to find the truth? Or would you take matters into your own hands? Comment trust or hands and give me one reason why. Please note, the following part may not mirror real events exactly, as some details are adapted for storytelling. The purpose is reflection. The detectives didn't want to see the binders. They wanted me at the precinct for voluntary questioning. I was taken to a small, windowless interview room that was a stark contrast to my mahogany office. It was cold-smelling of industrial floor cleaner and stale, lukewarm coffee. I sat at the cold, unyielding texture of the metal interview table, listening to the rhythmic tapping of Detective Miller's pen against a legal pad. They played the audio again on a tablet, the tinny, distorted sound of the speakers making my voice sound like a stranger's. Does that sound like a stable man to you, detective? I asked, leaning forward. Or a man being meticulously framed? That's for a judge to decide, Sir Miller replied. Right now, we're worried about the safety of the minor involved. The interview room was a box of mirrors, and every time I tried to point at the truth, Victoria's edit showed the detectives a monster instead. Vance revealed that the head of security I'd fired had also turned over a statement claiming I'd instructed him to illegally track Victoria's movements weeks ago. Miller slid a final document across the table. It wasn't a police report. It was a temporary restraining order naming me and Arlo, signed by a judge while I was sitting in the car. You won't be going home tonight, Mr. Sterling. You're not under arrest, but the judge signed a temporary restraining order. You'll stay here until we verify the audio's authenticity. And you won't be seeing your granddaughter either. How much of a man's life can be dismantled in the space of a single 4-minute audio file when the world is eager to believe he's already broken? I sat in that windowless cell. The tension was palpable while my son and my attorney moved through the city like a scalpel. While I was held, Corbin Mercer had mobilized a top-tier forensic audio analyst, a thin-wired woman with oversized headphones and a gaze that saw only waveforms and frequencies. Her fingers moved with a rhythmic tapping on the keyboard that sounded like a drumbeat of war. They identified microscopic digital artifacts and phase shifting that proved the recording Victoria leaked was a Frankenstein's monster of stitched audio. Arlo had provided the unedited shield and sword drive as the baseline, allowing the analyst to produce a side-by-side truth map that stripped the lie of its power. It's a hack job, Arlo, she muttered, the blue-green audio waveforms clashing on her high-res monitor. High-end software, but they left a digital fingerprint at the 214 mark. Show me the original, Arlo replied, his voice a low growl of anticipation. I want the district attorney to hear exactly how she baited him. I discovered later that Corbin hadn't just focused on the audio. He had found a secondary encrypted channel on the office server, a digital backdoor used to leak the file. It belonged to James Whitfield, a man who had sat at my table for 20 years and now looked like a cornered rat beneath the sterile boardroom lights. A lie is a fast ship, but the truth is the lighthouse that doesn't move. Eventually, the ship always finds the rocks. I revealed through Corbin that I had suspected James for weeks. I'd planted a canary file, a fake internal memo in the system that only James could access. The moment that file appeared in the news leak, his fate was sealed. The server logs don't lie, James Corbin told him, as the board members watched in stunned silence. You didn't just watch, you hit upload. Whitfield's face crumpled, the smell of expensive cologne and fear radiating off him as his bravado failed. She promised me the chair, Corbin, he shouted. Brooks is a relic of the past. The click of handcuffs closing over Whitfield's wrists was the final punctuation on his betrayal. By 10 o'clock that night, the district attorney had seen enough. The forensic report and Whitfield's panicked confession were an avalanche that buried Victoria's claims. The restraining order was vacated immediately. I walked out of the precinct, the cold, damp air of the Seattle night hitting my face with a clarity I hadn't felt since before Helena's funeral. Arlo was there leaning against the hood of my sedan, holding my keys. The order is gone, Brooks Corbin said, stepping into the street lamp's glow. You're free to go home. Juniper is waiting. Free. It's a strange word for a man who still has to face his granddaughter and explain why her mother is in a cage. But as Arlo handed me the keys, his hand lingered for a second on mine, a silent bridge across the years of exile. Let's finish this, I said, looking at the city skyline. I want Victoria to see the unedited version in court. As James was being processed, he'd admitted one final piece of the rot. Victoria had set up a secondary offshore account in Arlo's name, a long-term kickback scheme designed to be her final insurance policy against him. My attention was suddenly pulled away as Arlo's phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number in Portland. His face went pale in the neon light. He showed me the screen, a single grainy image of a warehouse engulfed in a massive orange fire. I stood on the sidewalk, the cold Seattle air filling my lungs for the first time in hours. But as Arlo handed me my car keys, his phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number in Portland. It was a single image of a warehouse fire. The orange jumpsuit didn't diminish Victoria's arrogance. If anything, the sterile walls of the prison visitation room seemed to sharpen her malice into a finer, more desperate edge. I sat on the cold metal stool, the sharp synthetic smell of industrial disinfectant clogging my nostrils, while the harsh flickering fluorescent hum overhead cast deep, unflattering shadows across her face. We were separated by a thick slab of plexiglass, smeared with the greasy fingerprints of the desperate people who had sat here before us. Victoria didn't wait for me to pick up the intercom. She glared at me, her lips curling in a sneer that I had once mistaken for confidence. You look small in here, Victoria, I said, my voice sounding tinny and distant through the speaker, small and remarkably predictable. You think you won because you found some papers, she hissed, her eyes darting toward the guard at the door. I'm still the only one who knows how to run Sterling Maritime. Arlo is a dock hand playing dress-up. I ignored the bait. I knew Arlo was in Portland at that very moment, standing amidst the charred remains of the warehouse she had likely ordered, burned to the ground, as a parting strike. I discovered then that her arson attempt was a failure. I had already purchased the property and placed it in Arlo's name as a surprise. Corbin later confirmed the fire had been ordered by James Whitfield. As part of their contingency plan, a scorched earth tactic triggered the moment the board vote failed. Her fire had only cleared the way for the new construction I was already funding. Click. The sound of the intercom cutting out, the sound of a life ending while the heart keeps beating. I waited for the line to reconnect before dropping the second hammer. The forensic team finished with the audio you leaked. I told her, watching for the first flicker of genuine fear. The district attorney has already added charges for tampering with evidence and malicious harassment. Whitfield didn't have your stomach for a fight, Victoria. He gave the DA everything, including the encrypted emails, where you explicitly ordered the hit on my reputation. That recording was the truth. She shrieked, her palms slamming against the partition. It doesn't matter if I edited it. It was how you treated me. Victoria was a captain who had scuttled her own ship just to keep anyone else from reaching the helm. Now she was just treading water in a very small tank. I leaned closer to the glass, the bitter metallic taste of prison coffee lingering on my tongue. You will never see Juniper again. I said each word, a slow, deliberate strike. I am initiating a full legal severance. the bloodline clause Helena created isn't just about the shares Victoria. It's a permanent shield. You are officially a stranger to the Sterling name. Her face contorted the arrogance finally fracturing into a high-pitched, desperate plea for a family solution. I am your daughter, she screamed, the sound muffled by the heavy metal doors clanging in the hallway. You can't erase 40 years. You were never a Sterling, I replied, standing up to leave. You were just a ghost we invited to dinner. I left her with one final piece of information, a parting gift from Helena. My wife had set up a modest trust for your biological father's family, I said, watching her eyes widen. But your theft triggered a clause that dissolved it. You accidentally robbed your own real family while you were trying to steal from mine. I didn't wait for her reaction. I hung up the receiver and walked through the rhythmic clanging of the security gates. I walked through the heavy steel doors and into the pouring Seattle rain, feeling lighter than I had in years. The cold air felt like a benediction. But as I reached my car, Arlo was standing there, his face pale and his voice tight as he held out a manila envelope. Dad, he said, his hand trembling slightly. There's one last thing in Helena's safe, something the nurses didn't find. How do you fight for a child's future in a building made of cold stone and rigid laws when the person you're fighting is the one who gave her life? I sat in the front seat of my sedan, the paper in the manila envelope feeling old and yellowed at the edges. It carried a scent I recognized from 40 years ago, the faint lingering trace of Helena's favorite rosewater. Arlo sat beside me, his profile sharp against the Seattle morning light. We were reviewing the final devastating evidence Helena had left behind. Inside the envelope, we found a notarized statement from Helena's hospice doctor, detailing a conversation he had overheard, where Victoria openly discussed liquidating Juniper's trust fund to cover her mounting shell company losses. She was going to rob her own daughter, Arlo. I whispered, my voice thick with a father's shame. Helena knew even then. Arlo nodded, his hands steady as he refolded the paper. This is the last nail, Dad. Let's go get her. I stepped out of the car, the muffled sound of traffic through the thick stone walls of the courthouse, reminding me that the world was still moving while my family's fate hung in the balance. I discovered as we entered that Kendrick's silent cooperation in the upcoming hearing had been bought by Victoria's secret lover, the bored traitor, Whitfield. Before his own arrest, Whitfield had tried to pay Kendrick a fortune to spirit Juniper away to Zurich, a desperate attempt to keep the child as a bargaining chip for Victoria's eventual legal defense. Kendrick, broken and facing decades of prison, had finally chosen a side that didn't involve a plane ticket. We entered the closed chambers where the smell of old books and floor wax sat heavy in the air. Judge Thorne, a woman with silver hair and a gaze that could peel the paint off a bulkhead, sat behind the elevated bench with the weary patience of a saint. Silence. In this room, it wasn't a weapon, it was a prayer. I watched the rhythmic scratching of a fountain pen on thick parchment as the judge's clerk prepared the record. I presented the evidence of the Zurich flight plans and the doctor's statement making it clear that Victoria's ambition had long ago eclipsed her capacity for motherhood. My granddaughter is not a bargaining chip, and she is not a fugitive. I told the court, my voice regaining the resonant authority of a man who knew his harbor. She is a Sterling. Kendrick sat in the back row, his head bowed, having already signed the papers to officially relinquish his parental rights. Mr. Redmond, do you have anything to add to the petitioner's statement? Judge Thorne asked. Kendrick only shook his head, a silent admission of his own cowardice. The judge's pen wasn't just moving across paper, it was drawing a line in the sand that Victoria would never be allowed to cross again. She reviewed the criminal indictment and the depth of the betrayal before looking at me. Primary custody is hereby awarded to Brooke Sterling, she announced, the sound of her gavel echoing like a heartbeat. May this child find the peace she's been denied. Thank you, Your Honor. I replied, the relief washing over me like a warm tide. She will. As I signed the final documents, I noticed a codicil Arlo had added to his own guardianship papers. He had already legally started the process to rename the Portland warehouse Helena's Haven. I looked at my son, realizing he had been building a memorial while I was still trying to survive the funeral. I walked down the courthouse steps, the heavy legal folder tucked under my arm like a shield. The cold, heavy weight of the brass door handles felt solid and real, a physical confirmation of the safety I had finally secured for my granddaughter. Dust motes danced in a single shaft of afternoon sun that managed to pierce the Seattle clouds. Arlo was waiting by the car, and for the first time, he didn't look like an exile. He looked like a man who finally had something to lose again. She's waiting at home, Dad, he said, his eyes reflecting a quiet, earned peace. But there's one person we still haven't talked to. The engine of the sedan hummed with a quiet satisfaction as we turned into the drive, the salt air finally smelling like home rather than a graveyard for the first time in months. Arlo sat in the passenger seat, his eyes tracking the familiar lines of the Sterling estate, with a look that wasn't just nostalgia, but a quiet earned belonging. We were returning not to mourn, but to build. We met Nurse Rosa in the sunroom, where the late morning light filtered through the glass in warm golden slats. I shared the details of our legal victory and the absolute finality of the DNA results, but it was Rosa who held the final piece of the map. She revealed that the one more person Arlo had mentioned was actually Helena's estranged sister, whom Victoria had kept away for years, with a web of systematic lies about our health and our wishes. I spent so long looking at the books, I forgot to look at the people she loved. I admitted feeling a pang of guilt that Rosa quickly soothed with a gentle hand on my arm. Helena didn't want you just to have the company Brooks, she whispered. She wanted you to have a family again. A company is just a collection of steel and contracts until you fill it with the right blood. Then it becomes a living thing. Later that afternoon, I sat at my mahogany desk, the one Victoria had tried so hard to claim, and felt the smooth, heavy weight of my fountain pen as I prepared to sign the transition papers. Arlo stood beside me, looking every bit the leader I had always hoped he would become. Juniper was playing on the rug at our feet, her laughter a bright silver thread through the room's history. "It's your ship now, Arlo," I said, the ink drying on the document that named him CEO. "I'll be on the shore if you need a lighthouse." Arlo gripped my shoulder, his strength grounding me. "I'm going to make sure the crew's pension fund is the first thing we double," he promised. I realized then that his time in Portland building Helena's haven from nothing had forged a better navigator than I ever could have trained in a high-rise office. By the time June arrived, the family gathered at the waterfront for the launch of the Helena Sterling Memorial Foundation. The smell of salt air lilies and fresh varnish on the dock was a tonic for the soul. I stood before the crowd, our employees, our friends, and our remaining family, and gave a speech that didn't once mention Victoria's betrayal. I spoke only of Helena's foresight and the vessel she built us to survive the storm. As we prepared to christen the Foundation's first mobile clinic boat, I discovered that Helena had pre-purchased the bottle of champagne herself, leaving a handwritten note inside the velvet box for Arlo. She had never doubted his return. To Helena, Arlo toasted his voice, clear and resonant. The finest navigator we ever knew. The horizon was clear, no fog, no hidden reefs, just the open sea. I watched the cold spray of champagne against the new boat's hull and felt the weight of the bloodline clause shift from a legal weapon to a protective embrace. As the sun began to set into a vibrant orange Pacific horizon, Corbin Mercer pulled me aside. He told me that Victoria had officially declined all her appeals. She had made one request for her cell, a copy of Helena's biography. It was the first sign of genuine reflection I'd heard of since the handcuffs clicked shut. I stood on the balcony long after the guests had departed, the sound of Arlo and Juniper's laughter drifting up from the garden like a benediction. I reached into my pocket and touched the small silver USB drive one last time. It felt cold and inert, its purpose finally served. With a flick of my wrist, I watched it arch into the dark, churning waters of the Sound. The secrets were buried. The legacy was alive. I watched the birthday candles flicker in the draft of the open sunroom, their small flames defiant against the breeze. Much like the secret I had carried in my pocket since the night I stood on that balcony and let the sea take the metal drive. The sweet waxy smell of extinguishing birthday candles drifted through the air as Juniper leaned in and blew out the last of her 11th year. The estate was transformed for her celebration, the first since the storm had passed. I stood back the warmth of the evening sun on my mahogany desk, feeling like a heavy, comforting hand. Out on the lawn, I watched Arlo teaching Juniper how to tie a proper bowline knot. A knot is only as strong as the tension you put it under, Juniper. I heard him say, his voice carrying the patient resonance of a man who had been through the fire. "Does that mean the family is a knot?" Grandpa Juniper asked, looking back at me with eyes that were finally bright and unburdened. I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. "It's exactly that, sweetheart. A knot that holds when the gale hits." I had realized that night on the balcony that Arlo needed to see me let go of the pain, so I had dropped a decoy drive into the churning waters of the Sound. But the final instruction Helena gave me to watch video 15 last had been a command I couldn't ignore. I had made one final copy on a single encrypted backup USB and today I finally felt I had earned the right to hear her last words. A birthday is a mile marker, a ledger is a map, but a video, that's a ghost trying to hold your hand. As the party wound down and the guests began to drift away, I retreated to the sanctuary of my study. I locked the door, the click sounding final in the quiet house. "One more time, Helena," I whispered to the empty room. Just the two of us. I inserted the USB, the soft click of the port, the only sound, until the soft, grainy texture of the playback filled the monitor. Helena wasn't in a hospital gown this time. She was sitting in the garden we both loved, looking healthy, radiant, and entirely at peace. She wasn't reciting ledgers or displaying fraud. She was simply looking at me. My love. She began her voice a warm melody that bridged the gap between worlds. The shield and sword was never about the money, Brooks. It was never even really about the company. It was about the surgical necessity of saving you and Arlo from a rot that would have consumed you both. She leaned closer to the lens, a soft smile touching her lips. I knew about the DNA truth for 20 years, Brooks. I discovered it accidentally during a medical screening when Victoria was a child. I kept it because I didn't want to lose the girl I was raising, and I didn't want to break the heart of the man I loved. She knew. For 20 years, she'd lived with a stranger's blood in the house, just to keep the man she loved whole. I felt the breath leave my lungs. Her discovery during her illness wasn't a discovery at all. It was a carefully timed performance. A masterstroke of psychological chess to force me into the action she knew I was too soft to take on my own. I played the villain in Victoria's story, so you could finally be the father Arlo deserved, she whispered. The rhythmic sound of the real waves hitting the bulkhead below my window, providing a bass note to her confession. Don't mourn the war, Brooks. Celebrate the peace we bought with it. She told me her final act was ensuring I lived long enough to see the man Arlo would become a man who didn't need a name to be a Sterling. The screen went black, but I didn't feel alone in the dark. I looked out the window at the sound, the same water that held the decoy, and realized that Helena's final gift wasn't the company. It was the fact that for the first time in 40 years, there were no more secrets left to sink. I saw Arlo's silhouette against the twilight sky as he walked Juniper back toward the house, and I knew the knot was finally secure. I stepped out onto the grass, the evening dew soaking into my leather shoes, and realized that for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't listening for the sound of a storm, I was just listening to the wind. The silence of the Sterling estate was no longer heavy with secrets or the clinical scent of hospice care. It was just a quiet July evening, the air smelling of cut grass and salt spray. I found Arlo by the fire pit, the orange glow of the embers reflecting in his eyes as he watched Juniper chase fireflies near the edge of the woods. I sat down beside him, the wood of the Adirondack chair creaking under my weight. We stayed like that for a long time, watching the girl's silhouette dance through the shadows. The rhythmic chirping of crickets in the garden created a soundtrack to our shared silence, a comfortable quiet that hadn't existed between us since before the exile. Arlo leaned forward, poking at a log until a spray of sparks rose into the darkening sky. "Thanks for staying in the fight, Dad," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't think I could have found my way back without you holding the light." I looked at him, feeling a surge of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "I didn't hold it, Arlo," I replied, my voice thick with a sudden sharp clarity. I just finally stopped trying to blow it out. Dad, 1 word, 3 letters. A lifetime of repair packed into a single breath. The single syllable bridged the final gap in our relationship, confirming that the ghost of Victoria's lies had finally been exorcised from our home. I reached over and gripped his shoulder, feeling the solid strength there, not the broken young man I had cast out, but a leader forged in the crucible of exile and redemption. Arlo revealed then that he had secretly been using Victoria's frozen personal assets to fund the initial scholarship program at the new center we were building. He was turning her theft into the Foundation's first act of charity, a move Helena would have found brilliantly poetic. "She always said the best revenge was turning poison into medicine," I murmured, watching Juniper's laughter echo across the lawn. "You learned that lesson better than I ever did." We sat there as the fire burned low, talking about the future, with a freedom neither of us had felt in years. Arlo shared his vision for expanding Sterling Maritime into humanitarian logistics, using our fleet to deliver medical supplies to disaster zones. I listened, feeling a deep pride that had nothing to do with profit margins or market dominance. This was legacy, not the kind measured in dollars, but in the lives we could touch with the resources Helena had fought so hard to protect. 2 months later, the The downtown streets were slick with a light Seattle rain as we gathered for the official unveiling of the Helena Sterling Center. The building was a masterpiece of glass and steel, its lobby smelling of fresh paint and expensive catering. I stood at the back of the auditorium, my hand resting on a cold marble pillar, watching as Arlo took the stage. Juniper stood proudly beside him, her small hand tucked into his. The Sterling Maritime logo was now paired with Helena's signature across the main wall, a visual testament to the legacy we had reclaimed. "We aren't just building a center," Arlo told the crowd, his voice filling the cavernous hall. "We're building a fortress for the truth." He spoke about supporting families navigating terminal illness and protecting corporate whistleblowers, merging Helena's two great life struggles into a single mission. "Mom would have loved the architecture," he said, looking toward me with a smile, "but she would have lived for the data." As the standing ovation echoed through the hall, Arlo did something I didn't expect. He mentioned a silent founder who had started the fund 40 years ago, a direct reference to the biological father Helena had protected. He acknowledged the full complexity of our history, without a hint of shame, letting the truth breathe in the open air. "The ledger is closed, Helena," I whispered to the empty space beside me. "The fleet is home. We did it." I felt Arlo's hand on my shoulder, firm and real. I walked out of the center and into the cool Seattle night, the neon lights reflecting in the puddles like scattered diamonds. The cold, clean feeling of the night air on my face was a benediction. I didn't look back at the building or the cameras. I just looked at the stars and realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't bracing for a betrayal or scanning the horizon for a coming gale. I was just walking one step at a time toward a future I had finally earned the right to see. The house was finally breathing with me, its heavy silence no longer a shroud of secrets, but a soft blanket of peace that settled over the polished mahogany and the empty hallways. I returned to my study late that September night, the cool night air following me in from the balcony where I had stood watching the stars. The mission was over, yet there was a finality I needed to claim within these four walls. As I reached for my laptop, I found a physical handwritten note tucked into the bottom of the case. It was old, the ink slightly faded, written by Helena, decades ago. It wasn't about shipping routes or forensic audits. It described the first time she saw me hold Arlo in the hospital, the way my hands had trembled with a terrifying, absolute love. It was the proof I needed that her entire plan, the shield and the sword, had always been rooted in that specific, enduring bond. "It's done, Helena," I whispered to the framed photo on my desk. "Every thread is tied." I sat down and began to clear the digital remnants of the war. I watched the cursor move as I deleted the temporary forensic files, the encrypted logs, and the bitter correspondence that had defined my life for the last year. Each click felt like releasing a breath I'd been holding since the day she died, a systematic unburdening that left me lighter with every deletion. I looked at her image and realized the job she gave me wasn't just to save the company. It was to save me from the coldness I had allowed to grow in my heart like barnacles on a neglected hull. "You can rest now," I told her, feeling the digital weight lift from my shoulders. And so can I. I performed one final check on the Helena Sterling Center's numbers, not out of the old gnawing suspicion, but out of a new sense of stewardship for the lives we were now touching. The first month's report showed 12 families receiving support, 3 whistleblowers given legal protection, and a waiting list that stretched into the hundreds. Helena's vision wasn't just alive, it was thriving, a living monument that did more good in 30 days than Victoria's greed had done harm in 3 years. The smell of old paper from the note and the scent of the sea through the window made the office feel more like a sanctuary than a war room. Darkness. It isn't always something to fear. Sometimes it's just the light finally allowing you to sleep. I had spent so many years fearing the shadows, never realizing that the brightest lights create the deepest ones. The city of Seattle was a distant hum beyond the thick glass, the Puget Sound tides retreating with a rhythmic, soothing sound that mirrored my own heartbeat. I felt the fading blue glow of the screen on my tired hands as I hovered over the start menu. I realized the password I had used for the final deletion of the vault files was begin Helena's last subtle command to stop looking backward at the wreckage and start looking at the horizon. No more audits, I murmured to the stillness of the house. No more shadows. Good night, Sterling Maritime. I watched the moon reflecting in the dark office window, a silver sliver of hope in the vast Pacific sky. I thought of Arlo and Juniper asleep in their rooms, safe under the roof I had almost allowed to collapse. I had spent my life as a captain of industry, but only now did I understand what it meant to truly guide a ship home. I took a long, slow breath, savoring the absence of any looming threat, the lack of an impending gale. The silence was a benediction. For 40 years, I had measured success in tonnage and profit margins in market share and quarterly returns. But standing here in the darkness of my study, I understood that the only metric that mattered was the sound of my son's voice calling me Dad, and the sight of my granddaughter sleeping peacefully in a house where truth had finally defeated treachery. The silver lid of the laptop closed with a soft final click that echoed through the room like a prayer answered. I didn't reach for the lamp to dispel the darkness. I just walked toward the window. I watched the first light of a new dawn touch the surface of the Sound, the water turning from black to a deep, promising gray, knowing the only thing left to navigate was the rest of my life. The war was over. The ship had come home. And for the first time since Helena closed her eyes for the last time, I felt ready to open mine fully to whatever morning brought. I often sit quietly now and think about everything that happened, about the anger, the betrayal, and the choices I made along the way. If there is one thing I want you to understand, it is this: don't let pride and silence build walls around the people you love. My story may sound like a dramatic family revenge story, but in truth, it began with small mistakes, the kind we ignore until they grow too big to fix. Looking back, I realized that some battles are won too late. I spent years believing strength meant enduring everything alone. That was my mistake. If you are listening to this as one of many grandpa's stories, remember that wisdom often arrives after the storm has already passed. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak honestly before resentment turns life into another family revenge story. Life has a way of humbling us. I believe God allowed me to walk through this chapter so I could finally understand the value of forgiveness and truth. Stories like mine may be told as a family revenge story, but I hope what stays with you is the lesson beneath it. Among all the grandpa stories shared in this world, perhaps the most important one is learning when to choose peace over revenge. And if this becomes one more of the grandpa stories you remember, let it remind you to protect your family before conflict destroys what matters most. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Please leave a comment and share your thoughts. What would you do if you found yourself in the same difficult situation I've faced? I truly value hearing different perspectives. If this story moved you in any way, consider subscribing so you don't miss future stories. A gentle note: although inspired by social themes and life experiences, certain elements were dramatized for storytelling. If this type of content isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos that may suit you better.